I just wanted to put before you a few thoughts about the future of IPCC, starting out with where we are coming from. You have heard now for an entire afternoon about the results, but I would like to give you a few more general results and thoughts, and as a consequence of them, then to offer a few lines of thoughts regarding the future. That's where we are coming from. You've heard about the synthesis report this entire afternoon, but the synthesis report is actually based on 3 comprehensive assessment reports by Working Group 1, 2, and 3. And on the left, you also see 2 special reports which were compiled during this assessment cycle, a report on renewable energy sources and climate change mitigation, and a report with the unwielding title, Managing the Risks of Extreme Events and Disasters to Advance Climate Change Adaptation. And I should say that very title was the object of a long deliberation in a scoping plenary. This whole material of knowledge is actually synthesized in this report, and you have heard some of the very short and crisp statements. I'm not going to repeat them. They are truly a reflection of the combination of the different results from the working groups, starting with a statement of fact that human influence on the climate system is clear, and ending actually with what I think is an optimistic statement that multiple pathways do exist to likely limit warming to below 2 degrees Celsius. Of course, you have also heard in these presentations that they do not exist forever, because as we continue to emit greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, we are continuing to change the radiative balance, and therefore these options actually are also a function of time, as is shown in this graph, which you probably now see for the 5th time, and which indicates to you that perhaps if you go home, you do take a look at this real synthesis graph, which I think many of us authors in the plenary last week, we were kind of nervous whether this graph would actually pass, whether or not some delegations would take an issue with some elements of this graph, and more risky actually with the combination of the 3. So this is the standard graph that is the last figure of the Working Group 1 assessment, which, by the way, took more than 8 hours of continuous arguing and explaining until finally the last delegation yielded in consensus. This one is a familiar graph by the Working Group 2, which for the first time also was addressed in a much more quantitative manner than in previous reports. It speaks to the different risks of, for example, unique threatened systems or extreme events, but also global aggregated impacts and various other impacts that are shown here on a range from undetectable with respect to the level of additional risks due to climate change up to very high in the purple colors. The third element of that graph comes from the 3rd working group, looking at the economics, giving us the reductions that are necessary by 2050, provided you want to achieve a climate target. And again, IPCC does not prescribe any climate target. In fact, if you look at the horizontal axis of the upper panel, you see a temperature range of additional warming since pre-industrial that goes from 0 degree to 5 degrees, which has the associated increase in risk with increasing temperature. If the policymakers want to limit climate change to less than 2 degrees warming, that is what happens to this left graph. And this is not a prescription. This is simply part of the negotiations and deliberations that go on at a much higher level than IPCC. That is at the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which will have its 20th conference this December in Lima, preparing for the 21st conference to take place in Paris in 2015. So if you want to limit to 2 degrees, of course, then the science can start speaking. The science can start explaining, giving the cumulative emission budget, but also, and that is most important, the uncertainties associated with it, indicated here in the width of that purple plume. From that 2 degrees, you can then go down into, first of all, the cumulative emissions and what it means to have a more than 50% chance to respect that climate target with emission reductions that are required between 25 and 55% by 2050. Now, previously you heard a different number, -40 to -70%. So what's the difference? Well, the difference is that the climate scientists offer to the policymakers a choice. How sure do you want to be? What do you want to tell the public? Do you want to tell the public we have taken decisions that ensure that we have a likelihood of more than 2/3 that we respect the climate target? Or would you want to give a message to the public that says, well, we just don't know. There is actually a good chance that we may stay below 2 degrees, but an equal chance that we may run over it. So depending on that level of probability that the messenger chooses, depending on that, you will communicate the necessary reductions of greenhouse gases, not only by 2050, but the whole information here is available also for the time horizon 2100. Let me now come to a few thoughts of how this enterprise, and as you have heard from the chair of IPCC, this unique enterprise of providing scientific information to the policymakers will develop after 25 years of operation. You wonder, is it still necessary? Do the policymakers still require that information? And I believe they do, because what you have heard today, new disciplines come into the fore for which we would like to get information. The information about impacts, about the regional consequences of climate change, their pervasiveness, their potential irreversibility, but also questions about equity, about values, and about the different thought systems across the world, cultural differences which certainly also play a role in addressing climate change. Now, I had the privilege to write a short article with Kaspar Plattner, the head of TSU, on how to do that. This is not a solution, it's just an input to the thought process, in which IPCC and the panel has started by forming a task group addressing the future of IPCC. That is common procedure at every end of the cycle of IPCC. There is a task group being formed. The results have not been spectacular in the past. Basically, a good model is being carried over into the next cycle, and that is certainly the default that many people are thinking about. But in order to actually provide the voice of the scientists into this process of the policymakers, we carried out a questionnaire. We asked a few questions to our lead authors, to 259 lead authors around the world who contributed to the assessment of the Working Group 1, with a few fundamental questions like, would you do it again? Yes, 68%. Was your experience a good one, a positive one, after all these deadlines, after all that hassle from the technical support unit, and sometimes also from the co-chairs to please respect the deadlines, to stay within the page limit, to do the assessment, to carry out the likelihood assessments, to provide us with headline statements. It's an endless list. Even after the approval, the authors thought they're now off the hook, but they had to carry on working for another few months to correct the report, to look at the proofs, to provide all the references and all the details. So in that regard, it's absolutely remarkable that Working Group 1 scientists rate their overall experience with good to excellent by a margin of 90%. And I get the feeling that this is not much different from Working Group 2 and 3, but that will be the subject of some evening discussion tonight. The amount of work was a challenge, obviously a question that I'm very interested because I know precisely how large the load of work was because I served in the third and the fourth assessment report as coordinating lead authors. And here there is also high agreement, not limited evidence, I should say, so we have very high confidence that what you see here is actually true. We also asked the question, would you like to have dedicated assistants? And obviously, if you ask a scientist to receive assistance, yes, of course, that would be welcome. But you see, the Working Group 1 scientists are really careful not to ask for too much, so it's 80% who would agree, to strongly agree that they would need dedicated assistance. And this is one point that I tried to really bring before the policymakers and the delegates. I know that Switzerland has actually lived up to that. France has done that too. Germany has done that too. Several other countries of around the world have lent some support to the scientists, and it just makes that extra difference. If you compare the assessment work 20 years ago to the assessment work now, it's just a different world. Due to the fact that climate science has so much flourished over the past 20 years, so many more publications, so much more evidence. We have also looked at possibilities of slightly, in physics we call that adiabatically improve the system and the assessment cycle. One possibility would be to extend its duration and reduce redundancies by implementing a longer cycle, but still a cycle that needs to be closely aligned to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change process that deals with the climate agreements. The longer delay between working groups would actually allow us to carry out a much better synthesis. This time around, we did have a somewhat longer delay between the different working groups. Working groups 2 and 3 came about half a year later than working group 1, but this is still tight if you consider that working group 2 has provided to the scientific community more than 2 petabytes of numerical data to be analyzed for impact research, for economic research, etc. Working groups 2 and 3 have had a delay of only 1 month or even less, which I don't know how that felt. We think that if you implement a somewhat longer cycle, you still should ensure that IPCC is providing up-to-date information, and that could actually be done either through special reports, but they are quite cumbersome because they require the same procedure. But perhaps a new innovation here of so-called topical assessment papers that would actually address cross-working group issues such as biogeochemical cycles and their impacts on marine ecosystems or climate targets and stabilization, just to name 2 examples. We still think that 3 working groups should provide their reports, but the redundancy could actually be reduced by incorporating these special papers into their reports as such, also reducing slight inconsistencies that necessarily arise in such a big endeavor. And a synthesis as you report, and you surely agree, is a useful thing to have. What we also hear often is that one should cut more across the different disciplines, the different working groups, although the impression that you got today is really that this work has come together. Of course, one could think of a series of special reports that are each produced by 2 leading working groups. We do have an example, quite a successful example, on this special report on extreme events, and one could think of interesting topics to do that as well. We would, however, caution for adding that just on top of everything else. If you go that route, then of course there should be a reduction somewhere else, and one could think of an overarching technical summary that would be derived from the material of the special reports, and this would then lead into a synthesis summary for policymakers. So these are just 2 examples of many more. What is important is to recognize that I say it once again, enhanced support, I do believe, will be necessary to be sure and to make absolutely clear that the quality of future assessments will be at least at the same level as the quality that we could ensure for the policymakers during the past 20 years. Because one thing will not go away, and that is the increasing number of publications in this part of the science. There are multiple challenges ahead. We are certainly called as scientists to provide actionable information, but information that is objective, is not prescriptive. We also would like to have much more regional detail, certainly from the physics through regional projections, but also, as you have seen, the rather course map that was shown regarding the impacts and the future of the impacts, which summarized regions, very large regions on the globe, that should be refined for decision makers to take their decisions and their planning and base their planning on in their regions. We also would like to see quantitative projections of impacts. Working Group 1, the physical science basis, about 15 years ago also used pictograms for extreme events. We're beyond that now, thanks to the progress of the science. And I'd like to see a time where also Working Group 2, in these very important aspects of impacts, would go beyond the pictograms and provide quantitative projections. We also need to be mindful of the science policy dialogue. The science assesses what is known, but it has to speak to the policymakers in a language that is understood. I think we have made major improvements between the 4th assessment report and the 5th assessment report, but I'm sure one could do much more. But irrespective of all that, there is one thing that must not be compromised, and that is the scientific quality and consistency of the assessment. Because it is the science that comes from these authors, and that is just a third, or I would say actually less than a third, of the scientists who provided their time and expertise voluntarily throughout the last 4 years with grand enthusiasm, wrote these many thousands of pages, including their summaries, always stood behind us. And there are these distinguished colleagues. These are just short shots from the approval plenary of the Working Group 1 report that took place in September 2013 in Stockholm. And you see, there is a dialogue. There is no finger pointing. These colleagues, they only pointed to actually the graphs and the PowerPoints that were up there on the screen, but they even more acutely pointed to the different versions of the language that were up there. But there was a dialogue, and the most important thing here is if that dialogue should result in a product that survives such a stress test between the science and the policymakers, we need 4 ingredients, and my Working Group 1 colleagues already know them. I had never the chance to actually convey that message to Working Group 2 and Working Group 3 colleagues, so here it is. Our assessment must be rigorous, it must be robust, it must be transparent, and it must be comprehensive. And that is also an element that is most important for the 6th assessment report, irrespective of what will be decided by the panel, and it is up to the panel to first decide that there will be a sixth assessment report, and then to decide how that sixth assessment report is actually organized and what elements it will contain. So with that, I'll leave you, and I would like to just point you to the two websites from which you can obtain all information, including these 7,000 pages and 2 petabytes of numerical data, everything there from this to the very short headline statements. So thank you very much.